just trust me on this.
Well, good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Evidently, someone has done their best to jam our ISDN line tonight. I apologize for this. When we were trying to connect, it was just a total disaster. It sounded like more feedback than you can even imagine, and it was obvious that something in the last couple days has changed on either my SDN line. Steve said his is working, so no doubt the gremlins are working overtime to keep, hassling us. Well, welcome to the Q-Files. This is a live show. The reason I was gone yesterday, I was getting back from northern Montana. I had gone up to both Glacier National Park and what's called the Koocanusa Reservoir, which is one of the largest freshwater reservoirs in the Pacific Northwest. Now, ladies and gentlemen, I had heard from just people that live up there that the water levels were unusually low. As a matter of fact, in Kalispell and Whitefish, the newspaper in that part of Montana was saying that they're expecting record droughts this year. And again, what most of people who are downstream from Montana don't understand is Montana is the headwaters for the Missouri River. And the reports that have been coming in from around the world, and especially around the United States, specifically the Pacific Northwest, is that we have massive temperature extremes that have never been experienced before. I mean, we're talking 15 to 20 degrees warmer than the averages. Bozeman, Montana is close to 80 degrees. Typically, this time of year, we should be about 65. So what's fascinating, I talked to some people in Burbank, California, and they were up to 106 yesterday, even though the official reports only put them at about 100 to 101. So what we're going to talk about tonight is just the extremes. Everything is going extreme, but meanwhile, the madness of kings and the madness of men come so close to interacting that it's hard to get the real feel for what's going on. Let's talk about the sun, the SUN. The sun has gone hyperactive. We've known that for a long time. Typically, the sun should have simmered down if it had been a normal period. It isn't. We know that the SOHO telescope, a specific solar telescope that's aimed at the sun continually, has its feeds interrupted when different intelligence agencies pull down the feeds because they don't want you and I, the poor dumb taxpayers, to see what's really going on. It is my contention that in the last week we have had a major crash, if you will, into the sun of a very positively charged body, whether it's a comet or asteroid, but that something has been disrupting the sun's not only magnetic field, but the whole the whole fusion process. And the fusion process is absolutely fascinating because, again, if we're changing anything in the sun, not we as man, but as the changes in the sun take place, obviously our weather is going to suffer. Then the question begs to be asked, could the boys with heart be playing? Now, I want to share this with you. I don't know which one it is, but Today seems to be the most unusual day just because we've got a situation now in Damascus, Syria, that could very much be the forerunner or the harbinger of Isaiah 17. We've got reports of up to 15 bombs having been exploded in Damascus at the Canadian Embassy, the British Embassy, U.S. Embassy, some other places, but 15 bombs going off. Then we've got the Russians making a lot of noise today in a very important article I'm going to read to you. That the Russians have made it known that NATO will go no further, and if they do, it's going to be basically World War III, and I'll get to that story in a moment. But again, back to the weather real quickly, because this affects you and I and everybody. I was paying $2.09 a gallon for gasoline in Kalispell, Montana over the weekend. Now, I want you to know something. That's not, $3 by any means. But when you take it into the context of water is life, life is dependent on food and water, and you see the water levels going down, you see the drought affecting different parts of the country, and if you notice this, that the area with the most extreme temperatures is the area directly over some of the largest remaining forests in the United States. And methinks something is rotten, not in Denmark, but in the Rocky Mountains. Now, for those of you that may not be aware of this, Oleg Kalugin, the former director of the GRU for the Soviet Union before he defected to the United States, a good friend of Colby's, former director of CIA, the point that he made in discussing the plans for World War III were always to start massive forest fires in the Pacific Northwest, basically to take away the cover and concealment, but also to interfere with commerce on a big way. I maintain that Al-Qaeda's battle plan is nothing more than excerpted and usurped Soviet war plans and mixed in with a little bit of a Chinese seasoning. So what we're now seeing in this part of the country, especially I'm speaking from the Northwest right now, is we're seeing really dire forecasts of drought, really nasty drought. And what's fascinating to me, when I was at the Koocanusa Reservoir, and that's kind of an interesting name, Koocanusa, it's where the longest railroad tunnel in the United States is. The dock, the boat ramp, I guess you'd call it, was 100 yards up on the bank of the river from where the water was. 100 yards. And if you looked at last year's high water mark, it looked like the water was down anywhere from 80 to 100 feet. So the point that I'm really trying to get across tonight is that when you've got this type of problems in the Pacific Northwest, even Lake McDonald, which is in Glacier Park, where the fire was last year, set by those 4 individuals that I talked about last year, the point is that even Lake McDonald looked incredibly low. Flathead Lake looked to be low, too, and what's even more fascinating, some of the rivers that should be experiencing spring runoff right now, they were as docile as some places that look like glass. They should have been roaring and raging, and the water should have been pouring down out of the mountains. But for the record, pretty much all the snow, and this was, March, the 22nd, 23rd, March 22nd, the mountains were almost all free of snow up there. And so we're talking about not only Canadian Rockies, but just some really extreme areas where the snow is the deepest, in at least the continental United States, and it's all gone. And so there is no spring runoff to speak of at this point. Now, that doesn't mean we can't get a bunch of massive rainstorms, but given the amount of spraying going on over Glacier, at one point, I think I counted 12 individual aircraft flying in opposite directions, and pretty soon, what would have been a beautiful blue sky for photographs turned into a kind of a grayish goo again, and it's just, typical. You can bet your bottom dollar that if the sky is blue, the boys will be flying. Now, initially, when the chemtrail project, and I'm going to say one of the parts of it was that Dr. Teller and the whole Majestic 12 guys, which are now called Magic, and they have some other names associated with them, Council of Wise Men, etc., etc. The point is that they were trying to put reflective particles into the upper atmosphere to keep the heat. Now, I believe you guys, they know specifically. For the record, for all those of you experiencing this thing that we're going to go into, or the thoughts that we're going into a new ice age, you're wrong. If you look at the Bible specifically states that it's going to get hotter than hell. And I don't mean that as a pun, I mean literally. It says that men's tongues are going to cleave to their mouth, and that it's going to be so scorching that that's one of the hallmarks of the end time. And I think that if there's a future glimpse that you need to grab a hold of tonight, it's just the extreme temperatures. Now, it's pretty tough for most people to fathom 142 degrees Fahrenheit. But literally, when you get into the temperatures of 119, 122, 135, up in that realm, it literally takes your breath away. And obviously, we've got our fighting men in Iraq, and we've got the situation over there escalating downward quickly. We've got the entire Syrian card now coming into play, and with the president's statement over the weekend that Iran will be dealt with, do you really think it's peace and harmony and it's a, Pepsi moment? I don't. Fascinating to me that still people cannot put two and two together and figure out that drought equals famine. And if those of you don't believe in inflation, ask yourself this: what are you paying for butter? What are you paying for milk? What are you paying for gasoline? What are you paying for the basic staples of life? One of my listeners sent me a email today telling me that the price of computer RAM, his son is in the computer business, and it's doubled in 10 days. I want to read this because I think, thanks Greg, it's pretty telling, okay? Everything's going up, and how can you expect to have a booming economy when the consumer, the American consumer, is burdened with debt, and people, the only way that they can stay in business to sell their stock, to get the stockholders happy, is to raise their prices. I can tell you this: it will boomerang on them quicker than you can say the end is near. Here's what he says, Greg: a co-worker of mine has a son who builds and repairs computers. Steve, he claims that within the past 10 days the cost of memory has doubled and may triple. Could this have a connection to the precious metals market? No. I'll tell you why. As circuits contain some of these metals, not enough to make that, but I'll tell you what is going on. Seems that an orchestrated plan is in works to raise all goods to high levels. Absolutely. It seems that almost everything is rising at an alarming rate. Boy, go try to build anything and buy lumber and you'll find out. How long can our current system hold out? My guess is just until one of the bones gets elected in November. Well, Greg, I got to agree with you. Now, ladies and gentlemen, it's not the price of precious metals that's driving up the RAM. It's the necessity or of the desire of all these companies to try and make what money they can make. Now, I want to share something with you. While I was up in the northern part of Montana, traipsing hundreds and hundreds of miles around there trying to get a feel for how bad the drought is, and again, if you don't understand what it means to have some of the biggest natural water reservoirs in the United States going to record low levels, all I can share with you is that people downstream, they won't have to use the word downstream much longer. It'll be down dry. Because, again, we've got the situation of the Colorado River, we've got the situation of the Rio Grande River, the great rivers of this country. The point is we've got some serious problems with a lack of fresh water. When it comes to the Great Lakes, or even plans, proposed secret plans to drain the lakes and to basically irrigate the United States if they have to. That was prior to the globalists having achieved their goal. Does it not bother you, I'm sure it does, that we are seeing just the continual pecking away and decimation of our rights, our liberties, our country, our economy, our morals? I mean, we are absolutely a wasting nation. And for those of you that are curious about the Old Testament, the Old Testament prophets, I would encourage you to go to Joel, because Joel talks about literally all of the blasting and the mildew and the palmer worm and the cankerworm and the locust literally eating up the staff of life. And again, I will just quote the John, the author of the book of Revelation, and men repented not. So the point is that as things become more perilous, it also seems to me that they become more obvious. But as they become more obvious, people choose, I would say this, to the degree that the obvious becomes more clear to some, to the many, they choose to even close their eyes tighter. Let's say before they might be squinting at the truth, now they basically are just going to avoid the truth at all costs. So pretty soon you will be getting the feeling that the haves versus the have-nots are going to, how should I say this, make their scene on the stage of history very, very quickly. Now, ladies and gentlemen, Doug Hagman, Northeast Intelligence Network, and the others have talked about the gentleman that was found with a wetsuit off of the nuclear power plant in upstate New York. He was a Nicaraguan. And for some time, we've been talking about the fact that FARC, that a lot of the Colombian terrorist groups, that Al-Qaeda has achieved something that no one thought they could do. Now, this isn't just Al-Qaeda. Let me make it clear so none of you have to send me an email saying, don't I see who's really behind this? Hey, look, I spent 5 hours on talk radio with George Norrie and Alex Jones last week, and we talked about this stuff. So I do understand the conspiracy, believe me. But again, what has to happen is it's not enough to beat your breast about the conspiracy. It's time to move. It's time to get going in your preparations like you've never prepared for before. I would tell you this. Those of you that our truckers, you may want to start getting your handles or your hands on and get a handle on people that sell water tanker trucks, because I can tell you this, a coming business is going to be able to deliver water as the different wells around the country run dry. People who have water transportation trucks will be filling cisterns by which a lot of people are going to be forced to live. Now, Stan and Holly Dale had to collect their rainwater in Australia in order to have a backup supply of fresh water. When I lived in Grand Cayman Islands, that's a lot of the fresh water there was caught during the rainy season and basically came off the roof into cistern or a holding tank. So for those of you who have been preparing, I will tell you this. You better double your water that you doubled even when I told you this a month ago. But better yet, if you have friends, and that's part of my goal, is to get people put together into cohesive groups. If you've got the resources, find a piece of property. If it doesn't have buildings on it, fine. The more remote, with a free-flowing creek, or those of you that say crick, you say crick, I say creek. Anything that with an artesian well, free-flowing water that originates on your property, I can tell you this, you will be the next wealthy people in the world, because again, the headwaters of the major rivers and the major areas of the world have been bought up secretly or basically legislated into United Nations biospheres. And I remember when it was Dr. Kaufman brought that to my attention. He said, "Did you notice, Steve, that all of the headwaters to the biggest pools, reservoirs, and sources, the headwaters for the fresh water in the United States, are all now seemingly being bought up, or not bought up, but legislated out into the biospheres under United Nations control?" And don't kid yourself, everyone. Remember the situation where the United Nations was talking about taxing fresh water in the United States by putting meters on wells? And well, I got to tell you, that's already happening in northern Montana up around Polson. One of the Indian tribes up there is now, even though you can buy land kind of on or off the reservation or borderline the reservation, they want to tax the water that the white guys, that's anybody other than an Indian up there, want to have use or have the ability to draw from. So, they're taking their cue from the United Nations. The United Nations is going to tax fresh water. And somebody said, well, over my dead body, and let me share this with you, they intended to be over your dead body. So knowing that, be forewarned. Now I want to read a story that's incredibly important. It's called Advance Over the Red Line, and I want to thank Bruce, one of my longtime listeners and supporters, for sending me this, because I didn't see it, and it makes so much sense now. It just makes incredible sense. This is on our website, www.stevequayle.com. We're linked to it. And it's Advance Over the Red Line, NATO's Encirclement of Russia Nears Completion. And this is by Vyacheslav Tetekin, and it's fascinating. This is translated from the Russian. On Monday the 29th of March, a meeting of the heads of state of the NATO member countries will take place in Washington, at which the entries of Bulgaria, Latvia, Lithuania, Slovakia, Slovenia, Estonia, and Romania into that alliance will become official. An analogous ceremony of foreign ministers will take place at NATO headquarters in Brussels. This is an event of no small importance, immeasurably more significant for us than the terrorist acts in Spain and recent events in the Balkans and the Mideast. A military concentration of several million soldiers, keep in mind this is being written from the Russian perspective, a military concentration of several million soldiers and officers equipped with the latest military technology and espousing an aggressive expansionist doctrine has now arrived at our borders. It goes on to say, Putin, who up to now has always regarded the approach of this armada with Olympian tranquility and tried to sell us on the idea that NATO is neither friend nor foe, simply a fact of life, but more of a friend after all, has suddenly shown signs of being disquieted. Unprecedented strategic exercises of the Army and Navy have begun. Even fuel has turned up. Pilots are once again flying. Ships are headed to sea, and tanks to the training ground. So when 3 submarine missiles launched, they failed recently, Putin's nervousness was visible. Up to now, Putin has also observed the open destruction of our armed forces with the same Olympian calm. We'll share some considerations on this subject with you on later on. But now let's refresh our memories regarding the recent history of NATO expansion. Now, understand this, everyone. This is an article saying that Russia had set a line in the sand that NATO would not expand beyond. Now, I can tell you point blank that NATO is, if you will, the New World Order's army. And in this article, they specifically talk about the New World Order. And it's fascinating because this is more confrontational than anything I have ever seen in my life. And not only that, but it basically is going right into the whole situation, is that, in essence, they're saying they're not going to allow it much longer. And it's a very, very, how do I say this, disconcerting that as we talk today on the radio and I talk to you on the radio, that World War III obviously is not only being planned, but it's being very much plotted. And I believe that we're still now starting to get the feel that 8,000 intercontinental ballistic missiles aimed at the United States, those are for real. And what else is fascinating to me is that McNamara, and in case you don't know this, Robert McNamara was a former defense secretary who was pretty much given credit for the mutual assured destruction. And I think he was also of Edsel fame, and meaning the Edsel, the car that was such a bomb. Maybe they're worth more money now, but it's pretty striking. I want to read this article to you. Understand, Russia right now is saying we've drawn a line in the sand. NATO's going past it. Here's what John Doherty of Newsmax.com says. The threat of devastating nuclear attack by Russia against the United States has not diminished, warns former Secretary of Defense Robert McNamara. Well, he ought to know, because that guy left us the most vulnerable, but even if he hadn't finished or started the job, I'm sure some of the current defense secretaries would have finished it. Writing in Monday's Los Angeles Times, McNamara and co-author Helen Caldecott, now there's a real princess for you, claim that the threat of nuclear catastrophe remains real, whether by accident, human fallibility, or malfeasance. The Soviet Union collapsed on itself, and the divide between Eastern communism and Western democracy disintegrated more than 13 years ago. Because of that, the nightmare scenario is not on the minds of many Americans today. Missiles still pointed at New York cities. Nevertheless, the threat remains serious. McNamara and Caldecott argue because despite the end of the Cold War, thousands of Russian nuclear warheads are still pointed at the U.S., targeting many civilian population centers. McNamara, Defense Secretary President Kennedy and Johnson, U.S., and Caldecott, a pediatrician and head of the Nuclear Policy Research Institute, say that the Russian nuclear targeting strategies haven't changed much, and certainly not enough to reflect the thaw in relations between both nations. Do you remember when that Clinton guy, the former president, got on and said, "My fellow Americans, for the first time in history, we can go to sleep at night," this is paraphrasing, "knowing that there are no Russian missiles pointed at any of our American cities." Clap, clap, clap. Yahoo! The liberals went crazy. The end of all threat. Well, the point is, guess what? Nothing changed. I think it was like this. Yes, we will tell the President of the United States that we will no longer target New York, but we will have targeted it, and we will target all their cities. 8,000 ICBMs. Now look, do I believe in that this stuff isn't all staged? Absolutely it's all staged. But does that mean there won't be a nuclear exchange? No way. It's coming, everyone. And this is something that people have tried to get, somebody said, I remember all that stuff. You're just trying to cause us to be fearful, like in the Bay of Pigs and the whole situation in the early 60s where we had to duck under our desks at school. Well, I got news for you. No, it's worse than that. You better consider doing more than ducking under your desk at school. They who duck under the desks at school are nothing but dead ducks. So here you have a situation that Newsmax.com is claiming that we're on target. And then I've just shared with you, advance over the red line. Things are getting very, very exciting, to say the least. Now, this is fascinating. The pair also cited January 2002 document from the U.S. Foreign Military Studies Office at Fort Leavenworth, Kansas, titled Prototypes for Targeting America, a Soviet Military Assessment. The study reports that New York City is the single most important target after military installations on the U.S. Atlantic coast. Both Standeo and I used to get a moron email all the time from some girl that, and if you're listening, I got to share something with you. You better get real, lady. This lady kept saying, am I a target in New York City? And we'd tell her, look at, here's what Soviet foreign policy is, here's what war doctrine is, and she still couldn't get it, okay? The study reports that New York City, let me read this again, is the single most important target after military installations on the U.S. Atlantic coast. In addition, a report commissioned in the 1980s by the U.S. Office of Technology Assessment is still as relevant today. It said Soviet nuclear plans call for aiming 2 1-megaton bombs at each of the following: the 3 airports serving New York City, Wall Street, boy, I bet you that makes arbitrage guys worried, each major bridge, all major rail centers, all